Chapter 17. The Evolution of Race Differences in Intelligence. 1. Africans. 2. Bushmen. 3. South Asians and North Africans. 4. Southeast Asians. 5. Pacific Islanders. 6. Australian Aborigines. 7. Europeans. 8. East Asians. 9. Arctic peoples. 10. Native Americans. 11. Conclusions. Know that the general principles of the evolution of intelligence and the crucial effects of climate on the evolution of race differences in intelligence and brain size have been set out in chapters 15 and 16. We are able to reconstruct, for each race, how and when the differences in intelligence evolved. We begin with the Homo erectus peoples, who flourished in equatorial Africa from approximately 1.7 million years ago to around 200,000 years ago. During this period, their brain size increased from about 885 ccs to about 1,186 cc. The reason for this increase in brain size is that in all mammals, intelligence has been under continual directional selection. That is, the more intelligent individuals left more surviving offspring, and this process was speeded up in the evolving hominids. At the end of this period, Homo sapiens had appeared, and the quality of their tools suggests that they were capable of Piaget's stage of concrete operational thinking, of the kind achieved by contemporary European 7 to 8-year-olds, indicating that their IQ was about 50. 1. Africans. During the last 200,000 years, the ancestors of the Africans continued to inhabit the tropical and subtropical environments of equatorial sub-Saharan Africa. This environment was not strongly cognitively demanding for them because primates had become adapted to it for some 60 million years. During the evolution of the hominids, Homo erectus were largely plant eaters, but supplemented their diets with scavenging the carcasses of animals killed by lions, leopards, and cheetahs. The evolving Africans lived much as hunter-gatherer peoples in tropical and subtropical environments do today, subsisting largely on plant foods, of which numerous species are available throughout the year, and on insects and eggs, with only occasional supplementation from animal meats obtained from hunting. The ready availability of plant foods, insects, and eggs throughout the year meant that the evolving African peoples in tropical and subtropical Africa did not have to hunt animals to obtain meat. A conference of anthropologists was convened in 1966 to debate the man-the-hunter thesis of the importance of hunting for contemporary hunter-gatherers, at which the consensus of opinion was that meat is of relatively little nutritional importance in the diets of modern tropical foragers. In 1999, a similar conference took place at which there was a consensus that hominid diets were primarily plant-based, as they are among modern tropical foragers. Hence, the Africans had no need to develop the intelligence, skills, tools, and weapons needed for hunting large mammals. Furthermore, the temperature of equatorial Africa varies annually between approximately 32 C in the hottest month and 17 C in the coldest, so the African peoples did not encounter the cognitively demanding requirements of having to make needles and thread for making clothes and tents, to make fires and keep them alight, or to prepare and store food for future consumption. It was relatively easy to keep babies, infants, and young children alive because there was no need to provide them with clothing, and from quite a young age they were capable of going out and foraging for food by themselves. Nevertheless, the brain size of the Africans increased during the last 200,000 or so years from approximately 1,186 to 1,276 cc, and it can be reasonably assumed that this entailed an increase in their intelligence too. Its contemporary value of 67%. This increase occurred because of continual directional selection for intelligence. That is, the more intelligent individuals had more surviving offspring. The genetical processes will have consisted of the increase in the frequencies of the alleles for higher IQs, and probably of some mutations for higher intelligence. If these mutations for higher intelligence appeared, they would have spread through the population, because high intelligence is a fitness characteristic, but they would not have spread so rapidly and extensively as in the races in temperate and cold climates because the selection pressures for higher intelligence were not so strong in the benign climate of equatorial Africa. The level of intelligence that evolved in the Africans was sufficient for them to make a little progress in the transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture, but not sufficient to develop anything that could be called a civilization with a written language and arithmetic, construction of a calendar, cities with substantial stone buildings, and other criteria set out by Baker. 2. Bushmen. It appears to have been around 100,000 years ago that some groups of archaic Africans began to migrate south, where they evolved into the Bushmen, who came to occupy most of southern Africa but of whom only a few tens of thousands survive today in the Kalahari Desert. During the last 100,000 years, the brain size of the Bushmen increased by approximately 10% to 1,270 cc, at which it stands today, and their IQ increased to 54%. The climate in southern Africa is warm-temperate with slightly cooler winters than in equatorial Africa. Nevertheless, the Bushmen were able to survive largely on plant foods, insects, and eggs as they do today. It has been reported by Stahl that Bushmen eat around 90 different plant foods, and these constitute 70 to 85% of their diet. Hence, they were not exposed to the cognitive demands of survival in a cold-temperate environment. Nevertheless, on a solely climatic theory of the evolution of race differences in intelligence, the Bushmen should have evolved a higher level of intelligence than the Africans. This failed to occur, and the IQ of the Bushmen today is lower than that of the Africans. The explanation for this is probably that some mutations for higher intelligence appeared in the Africans because of their large population that did not appear in the Bushmen because of their smaller numbers. However, the brain size of the Bushmen is only slightly smaller than that of Africans. This indicates that the mutant alleles for higher IQs that probably appeared in Africans and spread through the population were for neurological processes rather than for increased brain size. 3. South Asians and North Africans. The first groups to migrate out of sub-Saharan Africa colonized North Africa and Southwest Asia between about 100,000 to 90,000 years ago. In the period between about 90,000 to 60,000 years ago, they colonized the whole of South Asia. Here they were isolated from the Africans by distance and by the Sahara Desert and evolved into the South Asians and North Africans. They initially encountered a temperate climate similar to that of today, with the coldest winter month about 13 degrees Celsius. Around 70,000 years ago, the first ice ages began in the northern hemisphere and lasted until around 50,000 years ago. This was followed by a warmer period between around 50,000 and 28,000 years ago, and then by a second and more severe ice age that began around 28,000 years ago and lasted until around 10,000 years ago, when temperatures rose quite rapidly to the benign climate of today. During the main worm glaciation, winter temperatures in North Africa, Eurasia, and North America fell by approximately 5 degrees Celsius. And the coldest winter month in North Africa and South Asia fell to approximately 7 degrees Celsius. Survival during the ice ages for the peoples in the cold temperate environments in North Africa and South Asia, and later in the subarctic environment of Europe and Northern Asia, would have presented a number of cognitively demanding problems that would have acted as selection pressures for greater intelligence than was required in the tropical and subtropical climates of sub-Saharan Africa. There would have been 5 major problems. First, plant foods were not available during the winter and spring, and were not abundant even in the summer and autumn. Insects and reptiles were not available either, because these hibernate in temperate climates. The major source of food, therefore, became large mammals, such as antelope, deer, horses, and boars, that people had to hunt to secure food supplies. It would have been difficult to hunt these large mammals in the grasslands that covered much of the northern hemisphere during the last ice age, because there is good visibility for several thousand yards, and the herbivores have ample warning of approaching predators. Hunting in open grasslands is more difficult than in the woodlands of the tropics and subtropics, where there is plenty of cover for hunters to hide in. The humans that evolved in equatorial Africa were largely herbivorous and were not adapted for hunting large mammals, so this would have presented new cognitive problems for them. Large herbivores can run fast and are virtually impossible to catch simply by chasing after them. The only way of killing these animals was to make use of natural traps into which the animals could be driven and then killed. One of the most frequently exploited natural traps was narrow ravines, through which the beast could be driven, and where some of them would stumble and could be speared or clubbed by members of the group waiting in ambush. Another was cliffs towards which a group of men could drive a herd of herbivores, so that some of them would fall over the edge and be killed or sufficiently injured for other members of the hunting group to kill them. Other natural traps were bogs and the loops of rivers, into which hunting groups could drive herbivores and then kill them. Archaeological excavations have shown that all these traps were used by early humans in Eurasia. Working out strategies for cooperative group hunting and trapping large herbivores in these ways would have required an increase in cognitive ability. It has been shown that among contemporary hunter-gatherers, the proportions of foods obtained by hunting and by gathering varies according to latitude. Peoples in tropical and subtropical latitudes are largely gatherers, while peoples in temperate environments rely more on hunting, and peoples in Arctic and subarctic environments rely almost exclusively on hunting and fishing, and have to do so because plant foods are unavailable, except for berries and nuts in the summer and autumn. When people migrated into the temperate regions of North Africa and South Asia, many of those with low IQs could not survive the cold winters, and this raised the IQ of the survivors to 84. Second, the effective hunting of large herbivores required the manufacture of a variety of tools from stone, wood, and bone for making spears and for cutting up the carcasses. Some of these animals could be brought down by spears that had to be made by hafting or tying a sharp piece of stone, which had to be manufactured, onto the end of a shaft. When these peoples had brought down and killed a large herbivore, they would have had to skin it and cut it up into pieces of a size that could be carried back to the base camp for the women and children. These animals have thick skins and tough ligaments that are difficult to cut, and people would have needed sharp tools manufactured for these specific purposes. In subarctic environments, animals that are killed freeze fairly rapidly and become impossible to cut up. So the hunters had to have good cutting tools that would do the job quickly, before the carcasses froze solid. Peoples in cold environments need more tools of different kinds, and greater complexity than peoples in tropical and subtropical environments. This has been shown by Torrance, who has demonstrated an association between latitude and the number and complexity of tools used by contemporary hunter-gatherers. He found that hunter-gatherer peoples in tropical and subtropical latitudes, such as the Amazon basin and New Guinea, typically have between 10 and 20 different tools, whereas those in the colder northern latitudes of Siberia, Alaska, and Greenland have between 25 and 60 different tools. In addition, peoples in cold northern environments make more complex tools, involving the assembly of components, such as hafting a sharp piece of stone or bone onto the end of a spear and fixing a stone axe head onto a timber shaft. Third, another set of problems encountered by the peoples in the Northern Hemisphere would have been concerned with keeping warm. People had to solve the problems of making fires and shelters. Archaeological excavations have shown that during the Ice Ages, peoples in China and Europe were making fires. To do this, they would have had to learn how to make sparks by striking one stone against another, and then get these sparks to ignite dried grass. They would have needed a supply of dry grass and dry wood and animal dung or stored in caves to get their fires started and keep them going. This would have needed intelligence and forward planning. Peoples in sub-Saharan Africa and Australia also had fire, but it would have been easier to get fires going in the tropics and subtropics, because there would have been spontaneous bushfires from which ignited branches could be taken and carried back to camp to start domestic fires. The problems of starting fires and keeping them burning would have been considerably more difficult in Eurasia and North America than in the tropical and subtropical southern hemisphere. Fourth, a further problem of keeping warm would have necessitated the making of clothing and tents by sewing together animal skins. This entailed the drying and treatment of the skins of large herbivores and the manufacture of needles from bone and thread to sew skins together to make clothes and footwear. It would have been necessary to make clothes for babies and children as well as adults, Some people kept warm by living in caves, but in places where there were no caves, they used large bones and skins sewn together to make tents resembling the yurts that are still made in Mongolia. Fifth, the final problem for the peoples in temperate and cold environments concerned food storage. This was necessary because when they had killed and dismembered several large mammals, they could not eat them all within a few days, and they therefore needed to conserve them for future use. Some animals that could be killed are migratory and appear in any particular location for only short periods of time each year. This presents opportunities to kill large numbers of them, too many for immediate consumption, but they can be stored for future use. One example is reindeer that migrate regularly over long distances at certain times of the year. In many cases, they follow the same routes at the same time of year, so their appearance could be predicted by early humans who had acquired a knowledge of the seasons and the calendar from astronomical observations. Another migratory species is salmon, who migrate in large numbers at a certain time of the year from the sea up rivers in order to spawn. Many of these rivers are quite shallow, and it is not too difficult to spear large numbers of salmon as they swim upstream. It is also possible to catch them in nets, the construction of which was another cognitively demanding problem for peoples in Eurasia. These peoples would have been able to anticipate the arrival of these migrating herds and fish, and kill large numbers of them as they passed through. In very cold environments, the problem of storing food for future consumption could be solved for part of the year by building ice houses, which served as freezers for preserving the carcasses. Another solution was to cut the flesh into thin slices and dry them. If this is done properly, the pieces will remain edible for a considerable time, but if not, they become toxic. Some of the less intelligent, unable to do this properly, would have died from food poisoning. This would have been another of the many selection pressures acting to increase the intelligence of the peoples colonizing the niche of the temperate and cold environments. It has been suggested by Miller that the storage of food would also have required the formulation of rules for rationing its consumption, and that this would have involved the development of arithmetic to allocate it equitably. Among contemporary hunter-gatherers, it has been shown by Binford that there is a relationship between the extent to which they store food and the temperature of the environments in which they live. The colder the environments, the more they store food for future consumption. He reports that in general it is only in colder climates, where growing seasons are less than about 200 days, that hunter-gatherer peoples store food. In addition to these 5 cognitive problems of survival in the Northern Hemisphere, a further selection pressure for greater intelligence on these peoples would have been the operation of sexual selection by women. In Eurasia and North America, women would have become entirely dependent on men for much of the year to provide food for themselves and their children. In equatorial Africa and the Southern Hemisphere, where plant and insect foods are available throughout the year, women are relatively independent of men. Even women with infants and young dependent children can take these with them on foraging trips, or can leave them in the care of other women for a few hours while they go out and gather plant foods. It would have been more difficult and frequently impossible for women with infants and young children in the Northern Hemisphere to go out on hunting expeditions, possibly lasting several days, kill and dismember large mammals, and carry pieces of them for many miles back to camps. The effect of this would have been that women in the Northern Hemisphere would have depended on men to bring them food. They would therefore have tended to accept as mates intelligent men who were good at hunting and making tools and weapons. The effect of this sexual selection by women would have been that intelligent men would have had more children, and this would have increased the intelligence of the group. Another effect of the greater dependence of women on men in Eurasia would have been that men and women would become psychologically more closely bonded. This explains why the marriages and non-marital relationships of European and East Asian peoples are more stable than those of Africans. Survival in the cold environment of the Northern Hemisphere would have required an increase in general intelligence, defined as general problem-solving and learning ability, and in most of the primary cognitive abilities of which general intelligence is composed. Stronger reasoning ability would have been needed to solve all the new problems encountered in the cold northern latitudes, such as building shelters and fires, making clothes, and manufacturing more efficient tools for killing, butchering, and skinning large animals. Improved verbal ability would have been needed for better communication and discussions of how to solve these problems, for planning future activities, and for transmitting acquired cultural knowledge and skills to children. Improved visualization ability would have been needed for planning and executing group hunting strategies, for accurate aiming of spears and missiles, and for the manufacture of more sophisticated tools and weapons from stone, bone, and wood. Fathers would have shown sons how to chip flints to produce good cutting tools and to make spears with sharp points, and these skills would have been conveyed largely by watching and imitation, much as craft skills are learned today by apprentices watching skilled craftsmen, rather than by verbal explanations. Hunting and tool-making would have been undertaken principally by males, and this would be why it has virtually always been found that the visualization abilities are stronger in males than in females. There would have been less selection pressure on the peoples in the Northern Hemisphere to develop better short-term memory and perceptual speed, which explains why these abilities have not become so strongly enhanced among the Europeans as compared with the Africans. The selection pressures for enhanced intelligence in the temperate environment of North Africa and South Asia, and later in the subarctic environment of Europe and North Asia, would have acted on both men and women. The selection pressure on men for greater intelligence would have been the need to go on hunting expeditions to kill large mammals, and to make the tools required for this and for skinning and cutting them up. This would have required enhanced spatial intelligence and reasoning ability, which are greater on average in men than in women. Women would have needed enhanced general intelligence for lighting and maintaining fires and preserving food and storing it for future consumption. And they would have had the responsibility of keeping babies and young children alive by keeping them warm. The genetic processes occurring in the North Africans and South Asians would have been an increase in the frequencies of the alleles for higher intelligence, and probably the appearance of new mutations for higher intelligence, and their diffusion through the population. The most probable scenario is that the intelligence of North Africans and South Asians increased during both of the two ice ages, the first of which lasted between approximately 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, and the second of which lasted between approximately 28,000 and 10,000 years ago. The increase in intelligence after the end of the first of these two ice ages can be inferred from their more sophisticated tools and other artifacts. However, their intelligence did not increase to the level at which they were able to make the Neolithic transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture. This further increase in intelligence must have taken place during the second major ice age. The severity of the climate during this period will have been the main selection pressure that drove the brain size of the South Asians and North Africans up to 1,342 cc and their IQ up to 84. This was sufficient to allow them to make the Neolithic transition to settled agriculture and then to build the early civilizations along the valleys of the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus rivers, in which they developed cities, written languages, arithmetic, legal systems, and all the criteria of civilization. 4. Southeast Asians. Some of the peoples in South Asia migrated into Southeast Asia around 70,000 years ago and evolved into the Southeast Asians. This region enjoys a tropical and subtropical climate where the coldest monthly winter temperature is about 24 C. These peoples had reached this region before the onset of the ice ages that had little effect in Southeast Asia. Hence, they were under little selection pressure for an increase of intelligence. However, their IQ of 87 is fractionally higher than that of the North Africans and South Asians from whom they mostly evolved. The most probable explanation is that there is some East Asian admixture in the Southeast Asians from East Asians who have migrated south and interbred with indigenous populations. There has been substantial migration of East Asians into Southeast Asia. Thus, today in Singapore, 76% of the population are Chinese. In Malaysia, 30% of the population are Chinese, and there are significant Chinese minorities in Cambodia and Thailand. These East Asians have interbred with the indigenous peoples, and this has produced a racial hybrid population in Southeast Asia. As a result of this migration and intermating, the Southeast Asian peoples are closely related genetically to the Southern Chinese. The Chinese admixture in the Southeast Asians has introduced some of the alleles for high intelligence and raised their IQs to 87. This IQ enabled the Southeast Asians to make the Neolithic transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture, and then to build moderately impressive civilizations around 0 to 1000 AD. These civilizations appeared somewhat later than those of the South Asians and North Africans because the river valleys in Southeast Asia were densely forested and do not have the floodplains from which the agricultural surpluses were produced to sustain the first civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. However, from around 1000 AD, their IQs were not sufficient for them to be able to compete economically or in science and technology with the Europeans and the East Asians. 5. Pacific Islanders. It was only around 6,000 years ago that some Southeast Asians began to migrate into the Pacific Islands, where they evolved into the Pacific Islanders. Their IQ of 85 is not significantly different from that of 87% of the Southeast Asians from whom they largely evolved, and is likewise higher than would be expected from the benign climates they experience, where the coldest monthly winter temperature is about 24 C. The explanation for this is the same as for the Southeast Asians, namely an admixture with East Asians who migrated south and interbred with indigenous populations. The presence of significant East Asian ancestry in the Pacific Islanders is shown by their small teeth, which are small in East Asians but large in the Australian Aborigines. Unlike the Southeast Asians, the Pacific Islanders made only moderate progress in the Neolithic transition to settled agriculture, and no progress in developing civilizations. The explanation for this is that their populations have been so small, typically numbering only a few thousands, scattered on remote islands separated over huge distances. It was only the Maoris who had a large territory in New Zealand, but they only colonized the islands about the year 800 AD and have had insufficient time to produce a large population, make the full Neolithic transition, and begin to build a civilization. 6. Australian Aborigines. Some of the peoples of South Asia and East Asia migrated into the islands of the Indonesian archipelago and reached New Guinea about 65,000 years ago. About 60,000 years ago, some of these peoples migrated into Australia where they evolved into the Australian Aborigines. A closely related people survived in the highlands of New Guinea as the New Guinea Aborigines. The ancestors of the Australian Aborigines and the New Guineans were never exposed to the severe winters that began in South Asia, with the onset of the first ice age about 70,000 years ago. By this time, they would have been in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, or New Guinea, all of which lie on the equator or very close to it. They were not affected by the second ice age in the northern hemisphere. Thus, the Australian Aborigines and the New Guineans have the morphological features of a people who have evolved in tropical and subtropical environments and have never been exposed to a temperate climate. They are similar to the Africans in their dark skin, wide noses, long legs, slender trunk, and large teeth. Like other peoples who have evolved in tropical and subtropical environments, the New Guineans and the Australian Aborigines were able to live on plant foods, insects, and eggs throughout the year. When the Australian Aborigines were studied in the desert of Western Australia in the 20th century, it was found that they obtained 70 to 80% of their food from plants and most of the remainder from eggs and insects. They had no well-developed group hunting techniques. It has been estimated that the Gadio people, a tribe of New Guineans, obtained 96% of their food from plants and only 4% from meat. The ready availability of plant foods throughout the year, together with insects and eggs, meant that the Aboriginal peoples in tropical and subtropical New Guinea and Australia never had to rely on meat for their food supply and did not come under strong selection pressure to develop the cognitive abilities required to hunt large animals. Neither did they need to make clothes to keep warm. Even in the island of Tasmania off the south of Australia, the temperature in July, the coldest month of the year, averages 45 degrees E, and the Tasmanians habitually went naked. This explains why their intelligence and brain size are both low at an IQ of 62 and an average brain size of 1,225 cc. These are both a little lower than those of the Africans, with their one Guatemalan quetzal of 67 and average brain size of 1,280 cc. The most probable explanation for this is that the Africans were a much larger population in which mutations for higher intelligence had a greater chance of occurring, while the Australian Aborigines were much fewer. The number of Aboriginal New Guineans in the highlands of New Guinea is around 250,000. The number of Australian Aborigines in the 18th century when the Europeans first arrived is estimated at about 300,000. In such a small population, the probability of new mutations for higher intelligence occurring would have been low, and the geographical isolation of the Aborigines of Australia and New Guinea would have prevented the acquisition of these mutations from other races. When Europeans discovered Australia in the late 18th century, they found the Aborigines at a primitive level of cultural development. Their Mesolithic culture was without pottery, agriculture, or metals. They did not plant seeds to grow food or keep herds of animals. They did not store food for future consumption. As described by Bleakley, the Aborigine seems to have had no idea of conserving supplies against a hungry time. Thomas described the Aborigine as a nomad who knows neither pottery nor metalwork, has no domesticated animals, for the dingo is at most tamed, and he does not till the ground, depending for his sustenance on snakes and lizards, emus, grubs, and simple vegetable foods. Their main stone implements include the hafted stone axe and knife, and microliths mounted as barbs of spearheads, teeth of saw knives, and so on. Weapons consist of clubs, spears, spear throwers, and the boomerang. Women used digging sticks to uproot yams and other roots. They never invented or acquired the bow and arrow. Several of the British explorers and early anthropologists who studied the Aborigines in the 19th century concluded that they had a low level of intelligence. They are still but children in their mental development. Their languages lack numbers except for 1 and 2. 2 or a pair represent the extent of their numerals. Their languages were also lacking in abstract concepts and were poor in collective nouns, indicative of the inability to formulate general concepts that is one of the principal characteristics of intelligence. The Aborigines did, however, make primitive drawings of the human form which survive in the Jinmian rock shelter in the Northern Territories and which have been dated at about 58,000 years ago. Diamond attributes the failure of the Australian Aborigines to domesticate animals, or to develop agriculture, to the lack of domesticable animals, the poverty of domesticable plants, and the difficult soils and climate. But on the same page he tells us that yams, taro, and arrowroot grow wild in northern Australia, and could have been planted, and there are 2 indigenous wild grasses that could have been bred to produce cereals. The kangaroo and the dingo could have been domesticated by selective breeding for tameness over a number of generations. The climate of Australia is very varied, and apart from the deserts of the central region, is potentially suitable for the agriculture that was developed during the 19th and 20th centuries by Europeans. The Tasmanians had an even lower level of cultural development than the Aborigines of the Australian mainland. The Russian anthropologist Vladimir Kabo has written that they are the only society that persisted at the level of the late Paleolithic, right up to the beginning of European colonization. Captain William Bligh visited Tasmania in 1788 and described them as nomadic hunter-gatherers who had some miserable wigwams, in which were nothing but a few kangaroo skins spread on the ground. They moved from one area to another, foraging as they went, seeking out berries and fruits and the seeds of various bushes. Apart from kelp, they rarely carried food of any kind with them, and they usually went naked but occasionally draped a kangaroo skin over their bodies. They are the only known people who never discovered how to make fire. They were sometimes able to obtain fire from spontaneous bushfires, but if these went out, they had to wait for a new spontaneous bushfire or get it from a neighboring band. They never invented the device of hafting a sharp stone into a wooden shaft to make a spear or axe. When Europeans discovered the New Guineans in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found them at a slightly more advanced stage of cultural development than the Australian Aborigines. The New Guineans were largely hunter-gatherers, but they had some agriculture consisting of planting yams and bananas, and they had domesticated chickens and pigs. But until Europeans began to colonize them, all New Guineans were non-literate, dependent on stone tools, and politically not yet organized into states or chiefdoms. Following the European colonization, some of them moved into towns and, Villages and others remained in rural areas living as subsistence farmers. Europeans built and staffed schools for those in towns and villages, and boarding schools were established for those in rural areas, although some rural children did not attend school. Kelly described the lifestyle of typical rural and village tribes in Papua New Guinea in the 1970s. They lived largely by subsistence slash-and-burn agriculture carried out mainly by women. The men did some hunting, and some of them worked for wages on coffee plantations run by Europeans. The clothing of the less developed tribes consisted of skirts made from leaves and bark. Some of the tribes had counting systems that enabled them to count to 1,000, while others only had words for one, one plus, and many. The principal reason that the New Guineans were a little more advanced than the Australian Aborigines is that the coastal regions of the island were settled by Southeast Asians and Melanesian Pacific Islanders, who brought with them the taro, an edible root which they cultivated, and also domesticated chickens and pigs. The New Guineans adopted some of these cultural innovations but never developed anything that could be called a civilization with towns, substantial buildings, metalworking, a written language, or arithmetic. 7. Europeans. Some of the peoples who colonized the Near East between 100,000 and 90,000 years ago migrated northwards, and around 60,000 years ago reached the Caucasus, from which they spread into the Ukraine, and then, around 40,000 years ago, into Central and Western Europe. Other peoples from Southwest Asia began to colonize Southeast Europe from Anatolia. These peoples evolved into the Europeans with their paler skins, and in the north of Europe their fair hair and blue eyes. The Europeans were largely isolated from the South Asians and North Africans on the south by the Mediterranean Sea, and on the east by the Black and Caspian Seas, the high mountains of the Caucasus and Himalayas, and the Karakum Desert in present-day Turkmenistan. In the last ice age, which lasted from around 28,000 to 10,000 years ago, the winters were significantly colder than those in South Asia, with the coldest winter month falling to about -5 degrees Celsius. The terrain in Europe became similar to that of present-day Alaska and Siberia. The north of England, Germany, Russia, and the whole of Scandinavia were covered with a permanent ice sheet, and the remainder of Europe was cold grasslands and tundra with a few clumps of trees in sheltered places. These cold winters must have been the main selection pressure for an increase in the brain size and intelligence of the Europeans that drove the average brain size up to 1,369 cc and their one Guatemalan quetzal up to 99%. Expressing the increase in their brain size as encephalization quotients to control for body size, Cutler has estimated that pre-worm Europeans had an EQ of 7.3, and by the end of the worm glaciation they had an EQ of 8.1. When the ice sheets that covered northern Europe receded by about 10,000 years ago, the Europeans with their increased intelligence were able to make the Neolithic transition to settled agriculture. However, despite their high IQ, they were not able to develop early civilizations like those built by the South Asians and North Africans, because Europe was still cold, was covered with forest, and had heavy soils that were difficult to plow, unlike the light soils on which the early civilizations were built, and there were no river floodplains to provide annual highly fertile alluvial deposits, from which agricultural surpluses could be obtained to support an urban civilization and an intellectual class. From around BC 2500, the Europeans overcame these problems in the relatively benign climate of southern Europe, where they developed the first European civilizations in Crete and Greece. From around BC 700, the Italians began to build a civilization that eventually became the Roman Empire, and by 200 AD embraced the whole of Europe west of the Rhine and included the Danube Basin, the Near East, and North Africa. These first European civilizations in Greece and Rome surpassed those of the South Asians and North Africans in science, mathematics, technology, literature, philosophy, and the arts. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 455 AD and European culture suffered a setback in the ensuing Dark Ages, but from about the year 1000 AD it revived, and from around the year 1500, the Europeans became the foremost people in virtually all areas of civilization, as extensively documented by Murray. The genetical processes through which the higher IQs of the Europeans have evolved will have consisted of changes in allele frequencies towards a greater proportion of alleles for high intelligence, and probably also through the appearance of new mutations for higher intelligence, and the rapid spread of these through the population. The probability of new mutations for higher intelligence in the Europeans will have been increased by the stress of the extreme cold to which the Europeans were exposed. The lower IQs in the range 90 to 94 in Southeast Europe are probably attributable to some gene flow between South Asians and Europeans across the Dardanelles and Aegean, producing a cline of South Asian and European hybrids in the Balkans, with IQs intermediate between those of Europeans and South Asians. The same cline is present in Turkey, where the IQ of around 90% is only fractionally lower than in the Balkans. 8. East Asians. Some of the peoples of South and Central Asia began to colonize Northeast Asia in the region of present-day China between 60,000 and 50,000 years ago, where they evolved into the East Asians and later into the Arctic peoples of the far northeast. The archaic East Asians were largely isolated from the Europeans by the Gobi Desert to the west, and from the South Asians by the Himalayas to the south. The winters to which they were exposed were much more severe than in South Asia, and somewhat more severe than in Europe, with coldest winter temperatures falling to about -12°C during the main worm glaciation. The reasons for the intense winter cold in Northeast Asia, as compared with Europe, is that Northeast Asia a much larger landmass while Europe is much smaller, and that Europe is warmed by prevailing westerly winds from the Atlantic. It was in response to the cold winters that the East Asians evolved the cold adaptations of the flattened nose to prevent frostbite, the short legs and thick trunk to conserve heat, the subcutaneous layer of fat that gives the skin a yellowish appearance, the sparse facial hair in men, and the epicanthic eye fold to mitigate the effect of dazzle of reflected light from snow and ice. The severe winters would have acted as a strong selection for increased intelligence and raised the IQ of the East Asian peoples to 105. The genetic processes involved probably consisted of an increase in the frequencies of the alleles for high intelligence, and also of new mutations for higher intelligence resulting from chance and from severe cold stress. The appearance of new mutations may explain why East Asians have particularly strong visualization abilities as compared with Europeans. New mutations for enhanced visualization abilities may have appeared in East Asians and spread through the population because they were useful for hunting, tool-making, and navigation over long distances through featureless terrain. As with the Europeans, it is probable that most of the increase in the intelligence of the East Asians occurred during the main worm glaciation. This will have acted as the selection pressure for greater brain size and must have driven their IQ up to its present value of 105. It was not until after the end of the worm glaciation that their intelligence reached the level at which they were able to make the Neolithic transition to settled agriculture and then to build the civilization in the valley of the Yellow River and the subsequent developments of civilizations in China, Japan, and Korea. During the period between around 0 to 1500 AD, the Chinese built impressive civilizations that were in some respects in advance of those in Europe. For instance, the Chinese invented printing, paper money, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and the construction of canals with locks several centuries before the Europeans. During the period from 1500 to the present, however, the intellectual achievements of the East Asians have been less impressive than those of the Europeans, as has been exhaustively documented by Murray. Historians regard this as a major puzzle to which there is no consensus solution. One factor may be that the East Asians have evolved a higher degree of social conformity than the Europeans documented by Alec and Relo, and also expressed in their low level of psychopathic personality that one have documented in Lin. A low level of social conformity and an element of psychopathic personality appear to be ingredients in creative achievement because they reduce anxiety about social disapproval and appear to facilitate the generation of the original ideas that are required for the highest levels of scientific discovery. Another factor may be the historical accident suggested by Weed and Kampf that throughout much of its history, China was a single state whose autocratic rulers were able to suppress liberties including freedom of thought, more effectively than the rulers of the numerous European states, who were forced by competition to concede liberties to their peoples. 9. Arctic peoples. Sometime between 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, some of the archaic East Asian peoples migrated into the far northeast of Asia, where they evolved into the Arctic peoples. These peoples evolved into a separate race because they were geographically isolated from the East Asians on the south by the High Chersky, Khrebet, Khingan, and Sayan Mountains, and about 1,000 miles of forest north of the Amur River. The Arctic peoples experienced the severest winter conditions of all the races, with coldest winter temperatures of about -15 C and falling to about -20 C during the main worm glaciation. In response to these cold winters, the Arctic peoples evolved more pronounced forms of the morphological cold adaptations of the East Asians, consisting of the flattened nose, the short legs and thick trunk, the subcutaneous layer of fat that gives the skin a yellowish appearance, and the epicanthic eyefold. These severe winters would be expected to have acted as a strong selection for increased intelligence, but this evidently failed to occur because their IC is only 91. The explanation for this must lie in the small numbers of the Arctic peoples, whose population at the end of the 20th century was only approximately 56,000, as compared with approximately 1.4 billion East Asians. While it is impossible to make precise estimates of population sizes during the main worm glaciation, there can be no doubt that the East Asians were many times more numerous than the Arctic peoples. The effect of the difference in population size will have been that mutations for higher intelligence occurred and spread in the East Asians that never appeared in the Arctic peoples. The East Asians, consisting of the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, would have formed a single extended breeding population of demes, in which mutant alleles for high intelligence would have spread, but would not have been transmitted to the Arctic peoples isolated by high mountain ranges and long distance. The Arctic peoples did, however, evolve a larger brain size, approximately the same as that of the East Asians, so it is curious that they do not have the same intelligence. A possible explanation for this is that the Arctic peoples have evolved strong visual memory that would have been needed when they went out on long hunting expeditions and needed to remember landmarks in order to get home in largely featureless environments of snow and ice. An increase of this ability would have required an increase in brain size, but is not measured in intelligence tests. A further possibility is that one or more new mutant alleles for more efficient neurophysiological processes underlying intelligence may have appeared in the East Asians, but not in the Arctic peoples. There is a further anomaly in the intelligence of the peoples of Northeast Asia concerning the IQs of the Mongols of Mongolia and the closely related Samoyeds of northern Siberia. There are no studies of the intelligence of these peoples, but their low level of cultural development and technology suggests that it is not so high as that of the East Asians of China, Japan, and Korea. Yet these peoples also experienced many thousands of years of severe winter environments that have produced the pronounced morphological cold adaptations of the epicanthic eyefold, short legs, and thick trunk that evolved in the Arctic peoples. The probable explanation of this anomaly is the small population size of these peoples, and they have been isolated from neighboring peoples by the Gobi Desert and high mountain ranges, so new mutations for higher intelligence did not occur, and their geographical isolation would have prevented the acquisition of these mutations from other races. 10. Native Americans. The Native Americans evolved from peoples who migrated from Northeast Asia across the Bering Straits into Alaska, and then made their way southward into the Americas. The dates at which these crossings were made are disputed, and it has frequently been claimed that they occurred about 12,000 to 11,000 years ago. Contrary to these claims, there is strong evidence that they were made much earlier at around 40,000 years ago. This evidence comes both from the archaeological record and from genetic analysis. Archaeological finds of Amerindian artifacts have been dated by radiocarbon analysis at 24,000 years ago in Mexico, 30,000 years ago in California, 32,000 years ago in the northeast of Brazil, 35,000 to 43,000 years ago for a rock wall painting in the Serra da Capivara National Park in northeast Brazil, and 33,000 years ago at Monteverde in Chile. It must have taken several thousand years for these peoples to make their way from Alaska to South America, so the archaeological evidence points to the first peoples making the crossing at least 40,000 years ago. This archaeological evidence is corroborated by genetic analysis that also puts the first migration into the Americas at approximately 40,000 years ago. It seems most probable that there was an archaic East Asian people in Northeast Asia around 50,000 years ago, some of whom migrated northwards into Kamchatka and the Chursky Peninsula, and then made the crossing of the Bering Straits into Alaska around 40,000 years ago. Some of these peoples migrated southwards until they colonized the whole of the Americas and evolved into the Native American Indians, while the archaic East Asian peoples that remained in Northeast Asia evolved into the present-day East Asians. The relatively recent common origin of these two races is apparent from a number of genetic similarities. For instance, the rhesus-negative blood group allele is rare in both races. The Diego blood group is unique to these two races, and they both have similar coarse, straight black hair, shovel-incisor teeth, and the Inca bone in the skull. The archaic East Asian ancestors of the Native Americans who were present in Northeast Asia around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago were exposed to cold winters, but these were not so severe as those of the main worm glaciation of approximately 28,000 to 10,000 years ago, by which time the ancestors of the Native Americans had colonized the Americas. Hence, the Native Americans were never exposed to extreme cold, and do not have the morphological adaptations to severe cold that evolved in the East Asians. The nose is not recessed but is quite prominent, and they do not have the full East Asian eye fold or the short legs and thick trunk of the East Asians. In these respects they are similar to the Ainu, the original inhabitants of Japan, a few of whom survive on Hokkaido, who also do not have the cold adapted. Morphology of the East Asians because the climate of the Japanese islands was more maritime and less severe than that of mainland Northeast Asia. Thus, the Native Americans were established throughout the Americas by around 33,000 to 30,000 years ago. Those in the southern part of the United States and in Central and South America were not exposed to the severe conditions of the main worm glaciation, so they did not evolve either the morphological cold adaptations or the high IQ of the East Asians. Furthermore, once the ancestors of the Native Americans had crossed the Bering Straits and made their way down into the Americas, they would have found life a good deal easier than their ancestors had been accustomed to in Northeast Asia. They would have found a number of herbivorous mammals such as mammoth, antelope, sloth, armadillo, and bison, which were unused to being hunted by man. Normally, predators and prey evolve together in that predators become more intelligent in order to catch prey, and prey become more intelligent in order to evade predators. But the herbivorous animals of the Americas had no experience of predation by man and would have been easy game for the skilled hunters who had evolved for many thousands of years in the more severe environment of Northeast Asia. The Native Americans would have found large numbers of these herbivores that were easy to catch, and as they migrated southward they would have found plant foods more readily available, so that plant foods came to play a significant part in their diets. The evolution of intelligence in the Native Americans can be reconstructed as follows. The archaic East Asians from whom they evolved would have had higher intelligence than the South Asians, because they were exposed to the cold climate of Northeast Asia for around 20,000 years, between around 60,000 and 40,000 years ago. The ancestors of the Native Americans spent another few thousand years in Alaska, during which they experienced a severe climate that will have driven up their intelligence further. Once they were in the Americas south of Alaska, the selection pressure for any additional increase in intelligence would have been weak because of the benign climate and the ease of survival in the continent, hitherto unexploited by humans. This explains their present IC of 86, a little higher than the 84% of the South Asians but much below the 105 of the East Asians. This reconstruction provides further evidence that it was the selection pressure exerted by the main worm glaciation of approximately 28,000 to 10,000 years ago that must have raised the intelligence of the East Asians by around 19 IQ points above that of the Native Americans. There is a problem with this reconstruction that the Native Americans in the northern part of North America would have been exposed to severely cold winters during the main worm glaciation, and it would be expected that this would have increased their intelligence. The most probable explanation for why this did not occur is that the population of the Native Americans was quite small. The earliest reliable estimate of population sizes is for BC 400 and puts their number at approximately 1 million in North America. Hence, the probability of mutations for higher intelligence appearing in the Native Americans in the north of North America was quite small, and possibly did not occur or fewer of them appeared than in the much more numerous East Asians and Europeans. The Native Americans have the same profile of intelligence as the East Asians and the Arctic peoples, consisting of strong visualization abilities and weaker verbal abilities. The probable explanation for this common profile is that one or more mutations for higher visualization abilities appeared in the ancestral archaic East Asians around 50,000 years ago and were transmitted to the subsequent East Asians, Arctic peoples, and Native Americans who evolved from this ancestral population. Genetic studies have shown that there are genes determining the strength of visualization ability in addition to those determining the strength of the verbal abilities and of G. With their IQ of 86, the Native Americans were able to make the Neolithic transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture and then to build the civilizations of the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas. The reason that these were built in Central and South America and not in North America is probably that their numbers were much greater at approximately 11 million, as compared with only 2 million as of 500 AD. However, despite their reasonably impressive civilizations, the Native Americans were no match for the Europeans, who from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards had little difficulty in defeating them in battle, taking most of their lands and killing large numbers of them. 11. Conclusions. The IQs of the races set out in chapters 3 through 12 can be explained as having arisen from the different environments in which they evolved, and in particular from the ice ages in the northern hemisphere, exerting selection pressures for greater intelligence for survival during cold winters, and in addition from the appearance of mutations for higher intelligence appearing in the races with the larger populations and under the greatest cold stress. The IQ differences between the races explain the differences in achievement in making the Neolithic transition from hunter-gathering to settled agriculture, the building of early civilizations, and the development of mature civilizations during the last 2,000 years. The position of environmentalists that over the course of some 100,000 years peoples separated by geographical barriers in different parts of the world evolved into 10 different races with pronounced genetic differences in morphology, blood groups, and the incidence of genetic diseases, and yet have identical genotypes for intelligence, is so improbable that those who advance it must either be totally ignorant of the basic principles of evolutionary biology or else have a political agenda to deny the importance of race, or both. Appendix